Everyone, welcome and thank you for coming. This is the ninth edition of our monthly webinar, India in Asia series. This series aims to unpack India's changing position as a rising power in Asia. In particular, it asks what kind of roles can India play as a constructive actor in the region, and how do various countries of Asia, view India's rise. We have so far discussed India's relations with Maldives, with Philippines, Japan, Malaysia, several on India-ASEAN relations, and on Indo-US strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific. And the regular participants of this series would know that a couple of months ago, we also held a discussion at the beginning of the Iran war on India's relationship with wider Middle East. But today we are diving deeper into India's specific and very interesting bilateral relationship in West Asia, which is with the UAE. India-UAE relationship has considerably deepened in the last few years. Frankly, some of us who focus on other parts of the world, on Indian foreign policy in Southeast Asia, like me, it is a little surprising how close India and UAE have moved lately. They signed the comprehensive economic partnership in 2022 in a period when generally India was seen as somewhat reticent from signing FTAs. And now they have signed the comprehensive strategic defense partnership in the middle of an ongoing war in the region. And India has also joined the U2, which is a kind of multilateral partnership that it usually shies away from. So clearly, there's something going on here very interesting. And the strength of the relationship has truly been underscored during this war, given the kind of signaling that India has done in terms of how strongly it endorses UAE's position and gives diplomatic support to UAE. So to understand this relationship and how India fits into UAE's foreign policy, and also how India stacks up against UAE's relationship with other external actors like United States and China, we have with us to discuss these questions Dr. Narenappa Janardhan. He's the Director of Research and Analysis at Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy at Abu Dhabi. He's been there for 26 years. He has over 30 years of experience working on Gulf geopolitics, particularly focusing on partnerships between Gulf and Asia. He teaches diplomats on the issues of Gulf and Asian foreign policies. He's adjunct professor at universities in France and Israel. He's a non-resident fellow at Arab Gulf States Institute, Washington, Great Gam Lab, Arizona State University, and he was the managing assistant director of Journal of Arabian Studies. And I think I've just scratched the surface of various things that he has done in a very long career. He has written several books on Gulf foreign policy. His latest book is Global Gulf, which is Geoeconomic, Political, and Geotechnological Transformation of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. And he has a PhD from West Asian Studies Center, JNU. So Dr. Janardhan, welcome. I will hand it over to you, and then you can make your opening remarks, and then we'll jump into question and answers.
Thank you, Sandeep, and thanks for the invitation from the Institute of South Asian Studies. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you are in. First, a caveat. I'm not an Indian expert. I'm more of a Gulf expert. I'm also not a typical academic. I call myself a pracademic. I'm a practicing academic. I won't be too structured. I will share some observations on the evolution of India-UAE relations, how the foundation was laid in modern times, how it picked up pace, and where it may be headed, and perhaps plug the gaps and elaborate on some of the highlighted issues in the Q&A session. But before we get there, let me attempt to break the ice. I'm Indian head to toe, of course, but I wear an Emirati thinking cap, a Khaliji thinking cap. And it's really strange. When I finished my PhD in 2000 and came to the UAE, an Arab academic asked me what my PhD was about, and I told him that it was about the political systems in the Gulf and international relations of the Gulf. And he said it must have been a very short thesis because there's nothing much to write about. But 9/11 happened and things dramatically changed. At about the same time, a diplomat here in the UAE said, "What is India's foreign policy?" I said, it's pretty sophisticated, but nobody gives it enough credit. He said, "So what's so unique about it?" I said, we're good with the Americans, good with the Russians, good with the Israelis, doing a fair bit for the Palestinians. We're good with the Iranians. We're also good with the GCC countries. He said, what sort of foreign policy is this? You're either with us or you're against us. A typical line from Bush, right? I mean, that's exactly what he said. You're either with us or you're against us. And now look at what the UAE foreign policy or what the GCC countries' foreign policies are. They're pretty much equidistant, pretty much balanced, pretty much multi-aligned. So I think that is the, scene setting that I really want to do. And both India and the UAE have, sort of changed in the last 25 odd years that I've been here, along with the changing world. And my submission is that over the last 25 years, we have begun to live in a world where geoeconomics is generally increasing or conditioning geopolitics. I know some of you may disagree, but in my perspective, and I will sort of elaborate either through the course of this conversation or perhaps in the Q&A about why I think geoeconomics is influencing geopolitics rather than the other way around. As a result, I think more and more countries, especially India, UAE, and the other Gulf countries are becoming, and this is principally my argument, they are becoming non-ideological or pragmatic. I'll give you examples again. We also live in a multipolar world. And I think we also need to begin to maybe think not just as if we are living in a multipolar world, maybe we are living in an apolar world. There are really no poles for any of the countries to work around, So I think this is really an apolar world. It's multi-aligned. I like to play around with words. Several M's here. It is multi-aligned. It's market-driven. It's multi-networked. Even a multiplex, as Indian-American author and academic Amitav Acharya terms it. I think the shift from an ideological to a pragmatic relationship in Gulf-India ties can be traced back, at least in my view, to about the early 2000s, 2001 to be specific. It was the then Indian Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh's visit, not to the UAE, mind you, but to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was still the big brother in the region. It still commanded a great deal of influence, and it was the sole power, so to say, in the GCC region. And the basic problem between the GCC, and first of all, India was not really interested in developing great ties with the Gulf countries because it saw them as monarchies. It was more interested in developing ties with the other Arab countries, which were republics. And there was also a belief that the Saudi brand of Islam was influencing Pakistan, and that the GCC countries were closer to Pakistan than to India. And so in the conversation that took place in 2001 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia made a big change in its foreign policy approach. It said that from henceforth, Saudi Arabia would toe India's line on Kashmir. Principally, it said that it would toe India's line on Kashmir being a bilateral problem rather than requiring international mediation. International mediation was what Pakistan was seeking, and the GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE at that point, were supporting Pakistan's line and not India's. But once this call was made by Saudi Arabia, the other GCC countries also fell in line. And that dramatically improved India-Gulf relations, India-Saudi relations, and India-UAE relations in particular. Thereafter, it was about viewing Kashmir as a problem, as a bilateral problem between India and Pakistan, and that there was no need for third-party intervention. And since then, both India and the UAE and the Gulf countries have found their sweet spots to work with. Actually, UAE-India ties mirrors Gulf-Asia relations. And I won't get into that, but there are a lot of complementarities, and we have seen dramatic change in how Gulf-Asia relations have grown over the last 25 years. We'll keep that for another day. And to be fair, I think India was late in terms of recognizing the interest that was being shown by the GCC countries and by the UAE towards India as a partner. And I emphasize partner. I don't want to call it an alliance. India is not an ally of anyone. India is a partner to many countries, and so are the GCC countries increasingly beginning to see the value of partnerships rather than alliances. So it was the UAE and the GCC countries which first pursued a Look East policy. And it was much later that India, which was initially looking towards the traditional West, and finally began to pursue a Look West or Look West Asia policy. And since then, there have been a fair bit of strategic convergence between Look East and Think West policies. That's the UAE and India's foreign policy approaches. There have been plenty of complementarities. And it's important to note that UAE-India ties were growing even as no Indian Prime Minister had visited the UAE between 1981 and 2015. That's 34 years. We didn't have an Indian Prime Minister visit the UAE. The last one was Indira Gandhi in 1981, and in 2015, it was Narendra Modi. And so this, in a sense, contradicts the hype around diplomacy. We often say that diplomacy is very important. Reciprocal visits, heads of states visit to countries are very important. But here's a classic case of no head of state from India visiting the UAE for 34 years, and yet relationship blooming more than expected. And partly the reasons for the slow progress in India-UAE relations were due to the relationship being a victim of several scandals, what I call legacy issues, those which occurred between 2006 and 2010. And these involved DP World, Etisalat, and MR projects in India. And nobody wanted to really talk about it. A former Indian ambassador told me that when he spoke to the Prime Minister then, who was Dr. Manmohan Singh, he said, look, I don't have any answers to these legacy problems, and I will be totally embarrassed if these sort of questions come up in our deliberations. And as a result, I would like to avoid the UAE and move on to other GCC countries. But Narendra Modi took the bull by its horns. He came here to the UAE and said, well, I can't help the cases of the past. Here we are. I leave the courts to deal with them, but I can assure you henceforth, I take personal responsibility for any of the decisions that are taken and any of the deals that are signed. And I think that served as some sort of confidence building measure. And this part of the world likes strongmen. They like assurances. They like people who are ready to do business by taking risks. And I think things took off. So today we have a strange scenario where ties with the UAE is one of India's chief foreign policy successes. And there is an inherent contradiction in all this, right? Which is very apparent that an ideological party like the BJP and its government, which has a lot of ideological baggage in the domestic scenario, has become totally non-ideological when it comes to the relationship with the Muslim world, especially in West Asia. And the UAE is one of India's chief foreign policy successes. As a result, what we now have is from 400 Indians in the Trucial States in 1901. The UAE was called Trucial States until it became a federation in 1971. From 400 Indians in 1901, we currently have about 4.3 million Indians in the UAE. And from about $3 billion in bilateral trade in 2001, the trade bill now is more than $100 billion, and it is projected to double by 2032. So the ties have really come a long way. So the first takeaway is that the India-UAE relationship has evolved from a largely ideological to a buyer-seller or a transaction related, transactional, energy, trade, diaspora, because that was what it was rooted in: energy, trade, and diaspora. So from a buyer-seller relationship, it has moved into a multi-dimensional, comprehensive, and strategic partnership, and driven by economics, connectivity, technology, defense cooperation, and then the geopolitical hedging, wedging, sledging, call it what you want, balancing, bandwagoning, workarounding. All of these things are happening simultaneously. And so that's my first takeaway. And from this first takeaway stems my next takeaway, which is that many see the current West Asia conflict, or the US-Israel-Iran war and its related dynamics, as testing the UAE-India relationship. Maybe one cannot rule that out, but this is unlikely to derail the groovy train. Why? Because I think the relationship is just too symbiotic. It is, in my view, not a relationship that is a prisoner of the past. It is a partnership that is rooted in the present and for the future. They recognize each other's strengths and weaknesses. And for all those who are citing India's non-participation in mediation efforts, or lack of security support in defending UAE's interests during the war, or as Sandeep and I were talking a little while ago, as India having moved far too much towards the United States, and all of those dynamics, and seeing all this as if it's a sign of weakness or as an irritant in UAE-India ties, I think they're perhaps either exaggerating the concern a little too much, or they are not recognizing India's consistent foreign policy of non-interference in others' affairs. I think that really is the key. We all know that mediation and interference is a very bad word in Indian foreign policy lexicon, and especially given Kashmir's context. And I don't think India would like to, come to the defense of any country, or want to mediate, especially when it doesn't allow any other country to mediate on the Kashmir issue. And to be fair, I think the UAE recognizes India as non-intrusive, non-prescriptive, and non-judgmental. I think herein lies the root of why Gulf Asia relations have also grown. It's because of just these sort of principles: non-intrusive, non-prescriptive, non-judgmental. And I think India's balancing capability is highly valued by the UAE in a region which is very fragmented. And so, again, I've been saying geoeconomics. Yes, from the UAE's perspective, India is not simply a market. It's also increasingly viewed as a strategic stakeholder in regional stability. And in such a scenario, non-interference is not really a bad policy. Actually, maybe the UAE sees India's non-interference as more constructive, at least not destructive, right? Because the actions of some of the other partners of the UAE and the Gulf have been destructive while they have interfered, while they have remained engaged. I think we need to make a bit of a separation there. You can stay away, you can be neutral, and yet remain constructive. You can be part of the process, mediate, interfere, support, and yet be destructive. So the jury is still out. You can decide for yourselves where you want to place India, whether as a constructive force or a destructive force. But I think there's no real love lost. And they really stand to you, because I think all this means that, like many marriages in our part of the world, in the Oriental world, they put up with each other despite the relationship being imperfect, because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They stand to gain more being united than separated. The bilateral projects are too strategic, because it's amazing. I mean, some of us don't realize, we just read the headlines and move on. We have something called the Farm to Port project. Now, we should look at it economic engagement also as strategic, because often we tend to associate strategic dynamics only with security dynamics. I think there's a great deal of strategic value in economic partnerships, and the farm to port project that the India and UAE are involved in is one such. For example, the UAE wants to, ensure food security, but it can't buy land in India, agricultural land in India, like it has been able to buy in many other parts of the world. And so it's investing in better crop yields and food products that it really wants for its own market. And that investment then leads to also building infrastructure along the way, railroads, roads, storage facilities along the way, and eventually get that food over to the ports. And DP World already runs many ports in India. So as a result, this is called the Farm to Port project. It's a win-win sort of project. We also have, as a result, food security for energy security. And that's very strategic indeed. It's not purely economic if you look at the broader weight of such projects. And then beyond the bilateral, we keep talking about India-UAE relationship. I think we need to look at how that bilateral comfort zone has grown beyond bilateralism. It's now moved into minilateralism. We are already part of multilateral institutions, but I think the new form of diplomacy, which is gaining currency, is minilateralism. And the UAE and India are now part of bilateral, trilateral, and quadrilateral relationships, with France in the trilateral and with US and Israel in the I2U2 quadrilateral. And since 2018, the relationship has even moved into the security dynamics, because it's amazing that though there has been civilizational history and very robust trade, energy, and expatriate sort of association between the two countries, security was really not part of those dynamics. But since 2018, we now have joint military, navy, and air exercises taking place. And that has even expanded to the trilateral security cooperation with France. Three countries are working together on all those dynamics. And this is likely to grow in the future as non-traditional security, maritime security, and collective security assume greater importance amid US doubling down on the end of free riders, as we keep hearing all the time. Now, UAE and India bonhomie is also evident in CEPA. Sandeep already mentioned that. And it's interesting that the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement that was signed in 2022 was not only the first CEPA that the UAE signed, but it was signed in just 88 days of negotiations. And if you want to really compare that with anything else that has been happening or has happened or not happened, then you need to compare it with the EU GCC FTA negotiations, which are still stalled since 2008, after having actually started, the negotiations started in 1990. So 1990 to 2026, and we still don't have an EU GCC FTA. That also tells you a story of how much the world has changed, how Asia has come into the frame for the Gulf countries, how the global economic center of gravity has moved towards the East, and how geoeconomics has really trumped geopolitics and even geosecurity dynamics. So apart from CEPA, there's IMEC, it's Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's Mangrove Alliance, it's International Solar Alliance, it's BRICS, it's even Pact Silica. In all these, platforms, India and UAE work together. And UAE has just left the OPEC. This adds another thread to strengthen its relationship with India, because India will obviously be one of the major markets for the heavy lifting, or rather the production increase that the UAE is going to see in the years ahead. And so these two middle powers, and they are middle powers in their own right. Again, there could be a lot of debate about what constitutes middle powers. We can come to that later. But these two middle powers are happily married. still married, and there doesn't seem to be anything in the mix that's likely to rock their marriage. And like any other relationship, there may be that occasional turbulence, but there's no likely crash or crash landing in my view. And of course, many are citing what they call the Abrahamic versus Islamic coalition theories are being floated around. And to me, I think they remain mere smart categorizations to highlight either subtle alignment or disalignment of interests. They're certainly not alliances. They are partnerships of convenience, and partnerships are very flexible. There may be even some substance in all of these sort of categorizations, one that suits the current time. But I think these two countries and many other countries are just too pragmatic and flexible now. Countries are not letting their rigidity affect their strategic autonomy, at least in most of the Asian countries. Rigidity is not something that we are seeing in their foreign policies or in their economic policies. In fact, I would actually go a step further and say that strategic ambivalence is a greater virtue in today's international politics. It enhances strategic autonomy, because the more flexible you are, the more ambivalent you are, it actually gives you more teeth to play around your policies, to change them as and when required, and that enhances strategic autonomy in my view. So small, middle, great, and superpowers are all important, both to India and the UAE. And like India balances the Iran-UAE relations, the UAE also balances its China-India relations. Actually, the UAE has made it very clear that it follows a three-track association with the world. From an identity perspective, it's very Arab, it's Muslim, it's part of this region, West Asia, Middle East, whatever you want to call it. From an economy perspective, oil and trade are its bread and butter. And so its relations with the East, with Asia is very important. Africa too, now increasingly Latin America. And for lack of credible alternatives for the security dynamics, it still relies increasingly on the West. But even that's beginning to change, and we're going to see more and more of collective security mechanisms come into play in the future. The UAE definitely doesn't want, in terms of question that was asked in the pamphlet, how does the UAE treat India among its other relationships? I think the UAE does not expect India to replace any of them, certainly not the US military role. I don't think any of the Asian countries would really want to do the mistakes that the Americans have made in the past. I don't think they're going to put boots on the ground. So India is not going to serve as a replacement for anybody, certainly not for the US military role. Instead, I think India complements others. If we are really thinking of an alternative security arrangement for the region, I think India should be able to complement others, including US power, at least in the soft security dynamics and in the realm of non-traditional security. I think we really need to redefine security itself. Non-traditional security is now becoming more important than traditional security. And India is really attractive to the UAE, not because it belongs to any bloc, but precisely because it does not belong to any bloc. And ditto, it's the same for India when it deals with the UAE. So both see each other as not being a threat, and that really makes up for all the other shortcomings, if any. The leaders gel well, there's complementarity of interests. The two governments believe that the relationship is so solid and important that, and this is really crucial, and that there will be policy continuity, even if the leaderships change in the future. This is not the UAE betting on a certain government in India. It's the UAE betting on the continuity in India, the policy consistency in India. Because if you go back and think in terms of what happened during the Vajpayee government, in its first term, they were the ones who sort of realigned India's foreign policy. And then when we had the Manmohan Singh government come into play, for 10 years, there was policy continuity. Now we've had 12 years of the new government, furthering that. It's the belief in most parts of the world that there would be policy continuity if and when there would be a new government or a new party replacing the current one. I think that really is the key. And this is also important because we have seen with many other countries that are dealing with the Gulf, especially the United States, where you cannot really trust continuity of policies. You had the Obama administration sign the JCPOA. You had the Trump first term coming in and throwing out the JCPOA, and Biden kept talking about walking back into JCPOA. And we now have suddenly the United States, after waging war for 40 days and dilly-dallying for 60 days thereafter, now saying that we are back on track and negotiating with Iran. So at least, India does not do this sort of flip-flop. So that's one of the examples that I want to share in terms of saying that there is policy consistencies. So the UAE and India are too invested in each other to let any small irritants to torpedo their otherwise smooth sailing ship. They both appreciate partnerships over alliances. They both appreciate a de-hyphenated approach. I think this really is the key. They both have their own areas of strategic autonomy, and I think non-interference has been much appreciated. And it is precisely this flexibility which makes each other's company valuable. And so for all these reasons, the question is not whether India and the UAE will remain partners, but how far this partnership can evolve to become a pillar of what I call the emerging regional order. And this will be my final takeaway. I think the India-UAE partnership is not a sudden or short-term diplomatic success. It is a product of two long-term strategic orientations that increasingly overlap and will remain so amid this evolving global disorder. Hamid Ansari, former Indian vice president who was also Indian ambassador to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, once said that the UAE and the Gulf was always Indian friendly. I think it has now become India friendly too. And the same is true about Indian sentiments towards the UAE. Let me stop there. Happy to connect the dots in the Q&A session. Back to you, Sandeep.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting and such a broad perspective, but still so specific in many ways. But I have so many questions. I have, of course, we're open for also questions from our audience, and please add them in the chat box, or you can just message them directly to me. But also know that I will also have to abuse some of this moderator position and insert few of my own questions. And I start with the very basic one, which is that it's very interesting the way you framed it around the switch really happens around 9/11 and 2001, which is a very different way that, say, Eastern Asia, the history is seen, which is more of end of Cold War at the switching time. One of the key things that you talked about is how there's a decision in Saudi Arabia to change on the Kashmir policy. What is prompting that thinking? What is the rationale laid out for why we should switch this? Because to a certain degree, 9/11, all those events are disconnected, like not directly connected with India, right? So how does that shift happen?
I think it's the geoeconomics. You referred to Southeast Asia having a different model to make that switch and going back to the end of Cold War. And that was truly the era where geopolitics was sort of influencing geoeconomics. I think what happened with 2001, 9/11, is that the GCC countries began to face a lot of obstacles in terms of their economic orientation towards the West. There was a lot of suspicion among the Western countries about the GCC countries' investments, what this really meant, their influence, etc. Because there were a lot of colleagues who were involved in 9/11, and as a result, there was a great deal of suspicion in terms of their economic dynamics. So now they needed to find new avenues to continue with their diversification process, because we keep talking a lot about economic diversification in the Gulf now, but you should actually trace it back to about 25 years ago. They were already beginning to think in terms of a post-oil economy at that point. And I think that process was being disrupted by many of the Western governments. I remember very clearly, I think Gordon Brown at one point said, we don't need money from the sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf countries. America had a lot of problems with all the investments that the GCC countries were making. I think if you go back 3-4 years after 9/11, there was this famous episode of Dubai Ports World buying out some of the ports P&O in the United States, and the United States refused to allow DP World to continue those operations. Eventually, they said, we will not allow the devil, to sort of own these properties in the UAE, in the US. So many of those things, which eventually led the UAE to sell off that port to someone else. So all this meant that they had to look for new avenues. And luckily or unluckily, Asia was booming at that point in time. China had already announced its arrival on the stage. So the Southeast Asian countries had already made a big splash, right? So the GCC countries began to look at alternate markets. So that's point number one. Now, so by 9/11, it was also very evident that the liberalization policy and the privatization era had come into play in India as well. And as a result, Saudi Arabia recognized the market potential of India over the ideological affiliation with Pakistan, and decided that it's much better to go with Indian formula on Kashmir issue rather than with Pakistan's. Because, somewhere the ideological connection will remain, but it is the non-ideological framework that would have been appealing to India. So if that happened in 2001, there is another anecdote that I want to give you about 2006, when King Abdullah, after taking over, I think, was it as the king? Yes, on his first trip abroad, he went to India as well. And he was asked at that point in time, which of the prominent Muslims in India do you want to meet? And he said, I don't want to meet prominent Muslims. I want to meet prominent Indians, he said. So it was also a sort of, toning down of Saudi Arabia's own Wahhabi identity. India was always afraid of the Wahhabism having an influence and radicalizing Indian Muslims. So all these things somehow gelled well. But beyond those things, I think it's the market dynamics which really made a big shift in terms of how the GCC countries, or Saudi Arabia and India, or UAE in India, came together. You're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A box, but let me just insert one more. And I hope to insert a few more during the Q&A, which is, it is very interesting that to a certain degree, there is similarity between UAE, which is a small country, particularly Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and their economic model, which is more openness and a lot of becoming global economic hub, global financial hub, the openness to immigration, and multinational companies being located there, and all those things. That a particular, very specific kind of model built around small city states, which is a very similar model to Singapore. And in Southeast Asia, we see that Singapore, and to a certain degree, has a much better functioning relationship with India than Southeast Asia, rest of Southeast Asia, which is bigger countries, different economic models. And sometimes those economic models or those political approaches kind of do not gel exactly the right way with India. Do you think that similarly in the GCC countries, UAE is uniquely positioned in some ways because of its position, as a global city, Dubai being a global city, and all those things, that it kind of has a different approach some way than the other GCC countries? Or basically all GCC countries are essentially doing the same thing in India?
No. All the GCC countries are very different. I mean, India is so different within itself, right? Just the same within the GCC bloc as well. And Look, again, I think we are in that time and age where we can talk about the UAE as being a model among the GCC countries. But really, it was Kuwait which was the first open model, the first liberal model, the first progressive model that the GCC bloc saw. I mean, 50 years ago, if you asked anyone where you're headed in the Gulf, and they would always say Kuwait. Then it moved on to Bahrain, from Bahrain to the UAE. And now Saudi Arabia wants to sort of replicate that. But I think the UAE was the fastest, the quickest, the most nimble, the most flexible, and the most non-ideological. And I think full credit to Dubai for that, right? Because I think Dubai just broke the shackles of, being that traditional Islamic country, and threw all caution to wind and positioned itself as an El Dorado, positioned itself as this haven where there were taxes applied, everybody was welcome, everything was served, everything was sold. And they were the first ones to liberalize their economy by beginning to allow freehold property, by allowing expatriates to invest in the stock markets. All of those dynamics. The UAE again was the first to now come up post-COVID with what is equivalent to the PR in Singapore, with a long-term golden visa. So the UAE really became a trendsetter by allowing even expatriates to fully own property, not just property, but also businesses. So they have used every crisis rather than really get bogged down by any of the crises that took place. They have used it to their advantage. And really, that's why I always keep thinking that even after this crisis, which still hasn't really ended, they will be able to sort of bounce back. So the UAE is a model of its own. In fact, now what you see is that the other countries in the region are also beginning to copy the UAE's model. Now, almost all the other GCC, the UAE again was the first one to come up with VAT, value-added tax. So now most of the other GCC countries have imposed different degrees of VAT. Most of the other countries are now opening up their property market. They have also started giving these sort of golden visas to lure expatriates to continue to remain there and make those investments. So I think, yes, and that's why we always had this sort of comparison between Singapore and Dubai, Singapore and the UAE. For a long time, people would say that the UAE and Dubai were copying the Singapore model. At one point in time, just before the financial crisis, we had even reached the stage where some were saying that Dubai has outshone Singapore, and now Singapore needs to copy something from the Dubai model, etc. We leave that for another day. But I think there are certain commonalities. And I think essentially both Singapore and Dubai in general, they recognized that they lacked resources. They wanted to create this alternative economy, make themselves attractive. I think the one big difference between the two is that there are no taxes in the Gulf countries or in the UAE or in Dubai, whereas Singapore, you have a fairly high taxation, right? So I think that, okay, even if it is a tough life compared to, you got to pay for a lot of your services, whereas in the Gulf countries and especially in the UAE, you pay a lot less in terms. It has changed. We have a lot of, what we call indirect taxes, but that's something that was, always coming because of the non-oil economy that they were promoting and because of international pressure to come up with alternative sources of income. And I think it was also a message that they were sending out to others that you cannot just assume this to be a place where you can make all your money and not contribute back something to the system. And given the sort of governance structure that we have, which is not very different from what we have in Singapore, people are actually willing to pay those indirect taxes. So the UAE is a model of its own. You can draw a lot of commonalities. You can identify a lot of commonalities among the GCC countries, but I think there is a great deal of flexibility and innovation and, all these items, things like the push towards tolerance, the signing of the Abraham Accords were all geared towards actually making the system more non-ideological, more pragmatic, more tolerant. And that added a dynamic because this is the best place to come and do business. This is the best place to live with in terms of your family and, for non-Muslims, for example, to come and lead a life as which is akin to the life that they led back in their own countries. So I think it was a deliberate effort at crafting a new sort of state where pragmatism was really the most important thing rather than ideology. That said, I don't think they have forgotten their traditions. They have managed to keep a semblance of their tradition amid the modernity that they have moved into.
Let me ask two connected questions in the question box. One is by HP. Is UAE prepared for post-oil era? And then connected to this is a question from my colleague Pushpa, who asks, how does the UAE view India's rapid transition given UAE's major export to India is perhaps energy? He's not sure, but that given that India and other countries as well are trying to transition out of petrochemicals, how does that then affect UAE's plans for the future?
Yeah, sorry, what was the first question?
Is UAE prepared for post-oil era? Of course, post-oil era.
Yeah, look, I think a common answer to both those questions would be that we are sort of overestimating this notion of peak oil and the end of the oil era. I don't think that's really true at all, because fossil fuel will remain a very, very important and big component of the oil mix moving forward. The future is going to be fossil fuel plus, renewable plus, electric plus, and we don't know what else is going to come into the mix. But we are going to have all of those dynamics playing alongside with each other. And I don't think it's going to be easy for the developing world, including India, to make that transition away from fossil fuel to renewable energy to electric and all those dynamics. India is still going to rely on coal a lot, still going to rely on fossil fuel a lot. What is the percentage? I mean, if you look at China, 1 out of 2 cars, 50% of the new vehicles that are being sold are electric vehicles. What percentage of Indian vehicles that are being sold are electric? Minuscule, portion of Indian vehicles are electric. So I don't think we're going to change. Can the UAE sustain itself in terms of its post-oil economy? Yeah, you'll be surprised. Until about 10, 12 years ago, we kept hearing that 75% of the contribution to the UAE's GDP was coming from the oil economy. Today, they are very proudly announcing and advertising that 75% of their GDP is being contributed by non-oil sources. So that's a big claim, right? What they have done, and I think this is something that many people miss, that unlike the first oil boom where a lot of money was splurged, during the second oil boom from about the 90s onwards, they actually began to prepare for a post-oil economy. A lot of the talk about a post-oil economy has been recent, but I think they were already sort of plowing and sowing the seeds for a non-oil economy from the 90s onwards. And so they have utilized those resources very well. And just imagine, I mean, we don't pay enough attention to the amount of money they have there in their sovereign wealth funds. That's half the problem solved. If you have money in your pocket, half your problems are solved, right? Even in personal lives. So this is so typical of them too. They have roughly about just Abu Dhabi. It's called the capital of capital today, simply because it has roughly about $2.3 trillion worth of money in just Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth funds. And the UAE sovereign wealth funds together are almost inching towards $3 trillion. And the Gulf countries together have roughly between $5 and $6 trillion worth of money. So that's the sort of thing that is making them very, very influential powers around the world. So non-oil economy, come on. I mean, we had during COVID oil down to minus. and yet it didn't impact their growth. They bounced back. Now everybody is saying, yes, we have 6, 8, 10, 12% decline in growth over the last 3 months, but they're going to make up in the coming year. So they have already invested. They have put their monies in different places. They're all involved in every project around the world. Just take a look at the infrastructure projects. They're part of the UAE is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. UAE is part of IMEC. UAE is part of what they call the Development Road Project, which connects Iraq with Turkey and then on to Europe. So they have their hands in every pie. If that's one example, let me give you an example of how an oil producing country bid for IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. Right? This was in 2012, 2013. They campaigned heavily. It was their first diplomatic success in terms of ensuring that the IRENA headquarters came to Abu Dhabi. Why would an oil producing country want to host the headquarters of a renewable energy agency? Because they thought that the future, if there is going to be an energy transition, then they better be at the head of it rather than at the bottom of the table. And they didn't want to allow the Western countries to dictate terms in the renewable energy sector like they dictated terms in the oil sector. So they had, what do you need to produce, panels? You need sand. They have plenty of it. You need plenty of sunshine for renewable energy. They have it. And they wanted to prolong the lifespan of oil. If indeed oil remained at 60, 70, 80 in that range, then you want to prolong it for as long as possible to tap into it. So all these things meant that they brought in IRENA. And now data is the new oil. Why would these countries go into investing so heavily on technology? I mean, you saw that the GCC countries put in roughly about 2.5 trillion over 10 years is the sort of commitment they have made to the United States. Now, assuming that's a bit exaggerated, even if half the amount, even if 30%, 40% of that committed amount actually goes into setting up of these data centers, etc., they're already preparing for the next generation economy, e-commerce, e-economy, everything electric, everything tech driven. So data is the new oil for them. And so they are preparing. I think they can sustain themselves. To seal the deal, let me just give you a statement that was made, I think, about 5-6 years ago at the World Government Summit. The UAE president said that we will celebrate the export of the last barrel of oil. So that is, I think, a great deal of confidence that they have. And I think this sort of answers the question to the second one too, which is how will India-UAE relationship sustain itself if petrochemicals are not going to be part of the mix, energy mix. I already mentioned that it's not about just energy and trade and expatriates that the relationship is rooted in. It's much more than that. And again, as I said, there is no end to oil. And I also mentioned that the UAE leaving OPEC and ramping up its production from 3 point something to 5 million barrels per day soon by 2027 or so would mean that the UAE requires market, and India would be willing to buy as much as oil as possible. And it could work to be a win-win situation. I mean, the UAE needs a market and India needs a supplier to give them oil at the price that is convenient for India's growth and for India's democracy. So I think it will sustain itself.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions, so we'll have to move a little quickly to get through them. Let me read out a couple of questions. One is by Ambassador Jaideep Mazumdar. Eventually, oil and gas prices are expected to crash. Investor confidence in security and stability of the region has been shaken. I suppose this is about the war. Do you think these will have a significant impact on economic and geopolitical ambitions of the UAE? And related to that is also, given the fact what you're talking about the oil prices to a certain degree not being that important a factor in the economic model of these countries anymore, how much does OPEC matter as a agency? Like, because at a point in history, breaking away from OPEC used to be a huge deal. Is it really that big a deal anymore? I mean, disintegration or weakening of OPEC, does it matter to that degree, given the fact that maintenance of oil price in itself seems to be not something which is very high priority or an existential threat for these economies anymore?
Yeah, to the first question, I mean, again, I think I kind of answered that question. I don't think there would be a sharp fall. They will make sure in one way or the other that it remains in the sort of price band that everybody is comfortable with. Look, there is a great deal of unwritten understanding between the buyers and sellers. Nobody wants a very high price in the buying sector. Nobody wants a very low price in the selling sector. I think they will have some sort of an arrangement, whether that's overt, covert, whether it's through a deal or an unwritten rule. They will manage all that. And I don't think there will be a major crash. And if there is a crash, I told you, I think they're all sort of prepared. What you see in Saudi Arabia is trying to, again, now prepare for a non-oil economy. What you see in Qatar, gas. Gas is not going to fall or go out of fashion as much as maybe oil will go out of. So I don't think Qatar really has a problem. Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain are really very different from these three countries that we've been talking about. So let's put that aside. I don't think we're going to see. Let's not look too far ahead. Even 5-year foreign policies, 5-year economic policies don't work anymore. Let's look in terms of 1, 2, 3 years. Whoever expected COVID to happen, whoever expected this war to happen, and we are seeing quick and very flexible and change of policies coming about. So if really there were a crash to happen, we'll face it, because we've been hearing that the US stock market is going to crash, crash, crash. I mean, I haven't seen it will eventually happen. Everything that goes up has to come down someday, right? So this too may happen. But if that happens, I think they're far better prepared now than they were ever before, right? So look at the oil price crash that took place during the Arab boycott, right? At that point, they couldn't have really sustained themselves for too long. But now they definitely can sustain. And again, I sort of forgot the second question. You're talking about OPEC, yes. OPEC, look, I think there's a great deal of failure in the multilateral systems, and OPEC is also a multilateral system to a large extent. And my contention is that they are all bound to remain ineffective to a large extent rather than effective. I mean, there were a lot of countries which were not sticking to their quotas even while remaining within the OPEC. So it was inevitable sooner or later for them to come out, and UAE is not the first country to come out of OPEC. There are many other countries in the past that have done, and OPEC didn't collapse. It's really up to OPEC and OPEC Plus to see how much of a utility they serve in terms of being together, whether it helps their policies better or not. And so I don't read too much into it. UAE had been planning for it for a long time. I don't think UAE is going to be instrumental in leading to the collapse of OPEC. It now is really up to Saudi Arabia to deal with the OPEC crisis in a sense, or for Russia and Saudi Arabia to work together and ensure that OPEC Plus doesn't collapse either. So let's not read too much into it.
The next question is by Atyantika Mukherjee. You have noted that policy continuity and staying out of blocks are what attract New Delhi and Abu Dhabi to one another. However, with US increasingly enforcing a Pax Silica, enforcing alignments on frontier hardware, how can both countries maintain real policy continuity? Does their block-free stance risk fragmenting when they are forced to align with Washington on advanced computing but remain dependent on Beijing for green supply chains? Essentially, yeah. And also the broader Sino-US fragmentation of the world and a little bit of pushing on both sides of which side you need to go on. I suppose the pressure for that is much more evident in Southeast Asia, which is closer to China than, say, Middle East. But what is your take on that?
Look, my take is that the world is a lot flatter than it was 25 years ago, and it's becoming flatter by the day. So if the US imposes too many restrictions, and they did during the Biden administration, they imposed a lot of restrictions on the UAE in terms of what sort of chips the UAE could get. They imposed a lot of other restrictions in terms of saying without Abraham Accords, you're not going to get F-35s. But the UAE went about playing its own game. It said, if you are not going to give us what we want, then we will get it from elsewhere. And that's precisely what happened way back in 2009. The Americans and the French had also bid for the Baraka nuclear plant in the UAE, but the South Koreans got it. Simply because they were cheaper than the other two, and they were also willing to transfer technology. Transfer of technology is very, very important in any negotiations between the UAE and any tech superpower that may be. The UAE doesn't want to have a transactional relationship anymore. It just doesn't want to buy technology anymore. It wants transfer of technology. And I think India is also insisting a great deal of transfer of technology. There is a new sort of wave of South-South cooperation where countries are willing to share technology, transfer technology, and realize that the West has for too long imposed their diktats on them in terms of technology transfer, etc. And I think actually the India and UAE can work together to make sure that they don't fall into the American trap. And I think they will. I'll just give you an example in terms of how the UAE outsmarted the United States. Because after signing of the Abraham Accords, they were told that they cannot get the F-35s until and unless they walk out of the 5G deal with Huawei and China. Because it was interfering with the American information systems in the region, and that would impact their security policies, etc. And the UAE said at this point in time, for us, 5G and Huawei are more important than F-35s. So UAE actually suspended talks on F-35s with the Americans. So we are also increasingly seeing that these countries are coming of age. Even India is still coming of age. I think the more the United States becomes obstinate and inflexible, and we've seen that during Trump's second term, the more countries of the world, middle powers of the world, and that's the latest book that we have done. It's called Work Arounding, Tech Middle Power Cooperation in a Turbulent World. And the basic premise, the premise in that is that as long as the superpowers in the tech superpowers are going to impose themselves on the world, the middle powers are going to work around it. They were going to work between and among themselves and come up with new mechanisms to go about, plugging the gaps in the tech space. And we have tracked roughly about 200 deals between and among the middle powers in the last 5 years, and that doesn't involve the United States and China. What I mean to say is that, look, today America is the leader. The UAE diplomatic advisor to the president said in 2024 ahead of, because, we keep talking about UAE-US relations as being very important, but not until 2024 that a president of the United Arab Emirates actually went to the White House. The first time since 1971, the UAE president went to the White House was in 2024. And at that point, the UAE clearly said that everybody thought that the fundamental, link between the UAE and the United States was security. No, technology is the front and center of all relations between the UAE and US. 5 years later, China may be able to produce something better than the United States. And I think they retain that flexibility. That's why I say that it is that agility and flexibility on the part of the Gulf countries and the United Arab Emirates that's going to. And we are going to see the same with India too. India, as you said, was averse to FTAs, but the number of FTAs that they're signing in the recent past is also diversifying their basket of options. So even in the tech space, that's going to happen. And it's important that the UAE and India work together along with the other countries of the global south to ensure that they are not just consumers of this sort of tech revolution that is happening, but they remain active players. They're at the table, they're on the menu, and come up with policies where they are not either discriminated or exploited. And it's really upon us to do it. America, of course, is going to sort of call the shots, but we need to be alert and take evasive measures.
I have two questions, connected questions here. So I'll just read them both. One is by Mriganika Singh Tanwar. She is asking, there is clearly large focus on symbolism and leader level diplomacy in India-UAE relations. What are some of the strategic blind spots in the relationship that remain unaddressed and could potentially be a hurdle in the future for a mature strategic partnership? And then another question, which is sort of related by Kanika Kaur, is about geoeconomics. Whether it is indeed driving geoeconomics is indeed driving geopolitics, and how India and UAE can insulate bilateral wins such as CEPA from shocks like frozen IMAC corridor. Yeah, the weakness of the relationship versus the success of the relationship kind of thing. And while physical connectivity is stalled by the war, are we seeing a pivot toward digital and more advanced tech partnership as the immediate priority?
Yeah, to the first question, I mean, look, I already mentioned, I think we always sort of exaggerate and pay too much emphasis on leader to leader sort of relations and all those dynamics. India-UAE relations grew very well even without the leaders meeting for all those 34 years, the heads of state. So I think it's far more than that. There's ample, depth in that relationship. They're Siamese twins, if you want to call it that. They are joined at the hip on many issues. There is complementarity. We mentioned that. It's everything. It's connectivity, it's trade, it's energy, it's food, it's tech, it's security. So with all those dynamics, I think the leaders seeing each other just adds a bit of dynamism. That's it. I would give it 10%. Whereas the 90% is definitely rooted in all the other sectors that we are already involved in. So let's not look at those optics, which are for political reasons. Let us dig deep and see how that transformation has occurred beyond the leadership thing. And the next question was on IMEC, right? Frozen IMEC. I mean, please, let's just get out of that mindset of anything being frozen. BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, 2013 was when it started. 13 years later, there are still question marks about whether BRI has been a success or not. I mean, so if you want to look at the negative side, so please be, so be it. But if you want to look at the positive side, IMEC is not a sort of a startup in a sense, in literally a startup where you got to start from the first brick to something. It's already there are most of those. It's a disjointed connectivity project. You just have to connect the dots, and yes, that connection has stalled, but that doesn't mean that the IMEC project is frozen. There is a lot of harmonization of rules that's taking place. I mean, because let's not forget that IMEC is not just a physical infrastructure project. It's digital IMEC, it's energy IMEC, it's space IMEC, it's going to be people-to-people cultural IMEC. All those dynamics are going to play out. So we need to look at IMEC. Connectivity is king. Cash is no longer king, but connectivity is king. We need to remember that. We are in a phase of economic growth around the world where what we can call as corridorization of the world. There are going to be more and more corridors coming in. And I think IMEC's relevance has increased post-war, post-closure of Strait of Hormuz. You have to think of alternative routes. If Israel is not going to, in any way sort of compromise on its political agenda and continues to become the irritant, IMEC could take another form. It can bypass Israel. It can go through other entities. We have other options. You just saw recently that the Saudis announced a link between Turkey and Syria, right? So Syria becomes an option. We can also think in terms of integrating some of the existing corridors. It's a far-fetched attempt, but we can think of those things too. So we need to think out of the box. IMEC needs a bit of a godfather to make sure that if you call it a startup, that it becomes a unicorn. And I really don't think, fundamentally, let's remember one thing, that irrespective of which government is in power in India, India will grow. I always say that Indian economy grows at night when the government is asleep, right? So essentially, we are going to see that 6% growth taking place in one form or the other. India is going to become a bigger manufacturing house, relatively bigger manufacturing house. It has to look for exports. It has to look for corridors. It has to look for re-exports. And the UAE has to utilize its hubs and connectivity corridors. The Western economies are not doing well. You have to. And the most important thing is we think that chaos has led to decline in growth around the world. No, the last 25 years have been anything but chaotic. And yet, the GDP of the global GDP has increased threefold from about $35 trillion to about $100 trillion. And it's expected to double in the next 25 years. How are these goods going to move around the world? The existing corridors, whether it's the Suez Canal or whether it is the Strait of Hormuz or it's the BRI, they're not enough. You need more and more corridors. So don't lose your bets and hopes on IMEC. There's still a lot of life left, juice left in it.
There's a relatively technical question about SEPA. This is a question from Devyani Srivastav. That SEPA has been a landmark achievement in bilateral relations. Beyond trade figures, what are we actually seeing as the most meaningful change? Whether it's supply chain, investment flows, startup ecosystem, logistical manufacturing partnership, is SEPA actually beyond just improving movement of goods? Is there some other kind of change that happening in economic partnership in the last 3 years?
I think the big difference, we must fundamentally understand the difference between SEPA and FTA. The FTA was all about trade, whereas SEPA includes services. We are increasingly in a services-driven economy. So I think the big change that we saw was SEPA including services as part of the arrangement. And obviously there is something happening because trade figures have sort of jumped into double figures growth rate, 10, 12% since SEPA was signed. So there's something obviously taking place. And SEPA was also an effort by the UAE to sort of break the stalling of the negotiations for India GCC FTA. So it was a very clever move on the part of the UAE because the GCC as a bloc is not allowed to sign SEPAs or FTAs as a bilateral agreement. So the UAE cannot sign a FTA with India. It has to be as a GCC bloc. There are very few examples of FTAs happening. One is with the United States, which signed a FTA with Bahrain under perhaps coercion, which led to a lot of disunity among the GCC countries. There was another one with Oman. And a third was being negotiated with the UAE, but it infringed on their sovereignty. So the UAE walked out of that FTA dialogue and instead thought that if everything is going to be stuck, and very few GCC FTAs, one is with Singapore. Singapore actually did a FTA with Qatar, and then Qatar took it to GCC and got a collective thing done. Then there is one with, I think, South Korea. There is perhaps one with Pakistan and maybe one or two more, and that's it. So SEPA was really a breakthrough in terms of how the UAE could break that logjam. And most of those things that are happening is in the services sector, in the re-export sector. And I think that's where the harmonization of rules become very important. So all along these last 3 years, when we've been stuck with IMEC because of the Gaza war and because of this war, there has been a lot of harmonization of rules that are taking place in terms of movement of goods from, because each Indian port has a different mechanism in terms of the export rules and the landing rights and all of those dynamics when it comes to many of the UAE ports. And I think they're harmonizing all of that. Finance is an issue. All of that will change. And so SEPA has more than meets the eye as well.
Thanks. Since we are on this issue of various kind of connectivity and different kind of multilateral arrangements, what is UAE's take on I2U2? What is it trying to gain out of that?
Well, Look, I2U2, many of them see it as an ideological block. I don't see that too, because many even said I2U2 is like the Quad. But the principal difference between the two is that the Quad, it's a quadrilateral security dialogue. It was completely geared towards trying to counter China from a security perspective. And you know, didn't see much movement on the Quad until about 2021. But within the span of 4 years since I2U2 was announced, you have had heads of state already having a virtual dialogue and all of those dynamics. And fundamentally, unlike the Quad, it's an economic partnership. Yes, it has its ideological rootings in Israel coming into the fold, but it's, as I said, it's not a prisoner of the past. It's a partnership for the future. And I2U2 has some gains in just 4 years, which again, many people tend to overlook. One of the first mega projects that has been announced, and I think it was in 2023 or 2022 or 2023, and it was a $2.3 billion food security corridor project. And so there are already, and it was a remarkable project just in terms of the governments being less involved. This was a bottom-up project rather than a top-down project. It was the private sector which came up with a working plan on how they can make this work. And they sold it to the government, and the government bought into it, and that project continues. And you're going to see a lot of projects moving forward. IMEC is also an outcome of I2U2, which is an outcome of the Abraham Accords. So I think all these partnerships, they all have value, and one should not just read the ideological reasons or the meaning or the value in it. You must also look at what practical value or what practical role these sort of platforms play in furthering each country's interests.
Very quick follow-up. Are countries in I2U2 open to other countries joining I2U2, or is it closed?
No, it's not at all. We are open to everyone. In fact, we've had several track 2 events at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, and we actually sell it as I2U2 S2 because before the war, this current war, we had the Saudis almost being ready to normalize relations with Israel. So we thought Saudi Arabia could be one. We are inviting Singapore to be part of it. We had a track 2 with Middle East Institute. We think South Korea is a potential candidate. So you can think of any number. You can think of I3 if you want. In terms of Indonesia eventually coming on board, because Indonesia is already part of the Board of Peace. It had suggested that it would, put boots on the ground and be part of the international stabilization force in Gaza. So I don't think there is any ideological, baggage with I2U2 about any of these countries, because Trump is actually calling for, because Abraham Accords plus Kazakhstan has joined Abraham Accords. Though it doesn't really make sense. It's outside of, the Arab countries, but then Israel is pursuing what we call Abraham Accords plus. There is Syria, there is Lebanon, there is Pakistan, there is Afghanistan, there is Indonesia, all of these things. So eventually, if the Abraham Accords, again, it's not going to be typically the Abraham Accords. I think Abraham Accords is going to have a certain negative connotation moving forward. If you don't want to be part of Abraham Accords, normalization will happen indirectly with, in different ways. It will not be overt. It could be covert. It could be informal. Any of those dynamics. Already, I think there's a great deal of coordination between Saudi businessmen and Israeli businessmen that is going on with the blessings of the governments in a different way. So I2U2 can expand.
I have a question here from Mikhail. So, given the rise in far-right populism politics again in West, how have you seen it impact UAE's foreign policy? Do you think this has similar impact that 9/11 did?
No, I don't think these countries are unduly worried. I think these countries have made a very clear distinction between domestic politics and international relations. If we really want to ask this question about Western countries, right-wing populism, we must ask the same question about India's, right-wing populism as well. Did that affect India-UAE relations? No. So I don't think it's really going to impact, because the Western politicians too, the Western governments too, as they emerge out of right-wing populism, even if they are right-wing governments in the West, they clearly understand. I mean, Trump's is a right-wing government, isn't it? Did it impact their relations with the GCC countries or with the UAE? No, in fact, it took off during the first term. It just goes to show that, and that's why I keep emphasizing that it's geoeconomics which is impacting geopolitics and not the other way around. So as long as the right-wing, governments in the West are not going to mix their domestic politics with their international affairs, and limited to just their immigration policies and otherwise, I don't think the GCC countries really have a problem. They're willing to separate the ideological issues in the domestic scenario and ensure that the international relations plays out in the economic zone.
Let me ask one last question, which is very relevant from Southeast Asian perspective. There's a lot of concern here about the legal precedent created if the idea is that after the war, the Strait of Hormuz is something which is not, free transit, but some kind of control by one or several countries, or there's some toll or something or the other, right? In fact, Singapore has very openly said that on principle, it will not participate in something like that. What is UAE's position? What would UAE like to see happen, and what has it been its politics on this issue?
I think it's very clear that UAE obviously doesn't want any change. They want status quo ante. Will it be that? That really is the question. Will Iran walk the talk, or is it using the toll and service charges, etc., as a bargaining tool in its negotiations? We'll have to really wait and see. But there is clearly no doubt what many other GCC countries, including the UAE or many other countries in the world, want, and they all want freedom of navigation. They want status quo ante. So we'll have to really wait and see. Of course, Iran is saying that it's in negotiations with Oman, and that is throwing a spanner in the wheel in a sense in terms of how Oman has to react. For now, Oman has said it is not interested. Maybe they're having, back channel dialogues. Maybe some figures are being thrown out there. Maybe Oman sees economic value in this. Iran definitely sees economic value in this. And as a result, we'll have to really wait and watch to see how this pans out. But my, gut feeling is that Iran is using this as a bargaining chip more than anything else.
But I think we have gone way past our allotted time. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. And I suppose the sign of how interesting your initial remarks were that they evoked so many questions that I couldn't even get to all of them. And I apologize to the ones that I couldn't get to, especially because selfishly I inserted a few of my own. But thank you so much. This was a very interesting and very useful conversation, a very timely one. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please join us again next month. When our series will be, the next iteration of the series will be on China and whether China sees India as a rising power or not. And with that, thank you very much. Thank you to our speaker, and hopefully we'll stay in touch.
Thank you. Best wishes to everyone.
Bye.